What do I mean by relational trauma? Here I'm talking about trauma that's occurred usually chronically and usually within the context of significant relationships, family members, people that they know. Research shows that relational trauma is far more devastating than, in terms of PTSD, than even the trauma of war, because it involves being abused by those you trust. And it results in disorganized and disoriented, insecure attachments and a negative internal working model. So what does that mean? It means that when you view the world, you think of people in a way that makes you not trust them. You expect that you will be hurt. That's your internal working model if you've been abused. You expect that the world will not, life will not go well for you. That's the expectation. And sometimes those expectations lead you to lead you to expect it, and then it gets reenacted over and over again. Sometimes that reenactment relates to the wish to master the fact that you've been mistreated by someone you loved. Okay. Effects of trauma, we've talked about affect regulation. So traumatized children have a hard time following cues, mainly following their own internal cues, to know what they're feeling. In order to be able to deal with the trauma, they've had to turn off their feelings. They've had to numb out. They've had to freeze, or the whole fight or flight. Or they have an alarm system that's been set and it's chronic, so that they have a certain kind of overreactivity. The blunting of the affect, the numbness, somatization and physiological dysregulation. Again, what they can't put in words gets expressed via the body. They have reduced self-awareness, introspection, and attention to their internal states. So why is this important? We've seen that traumatized and abused kids are at a higher risk for suicide. What happens when you're trying to work with a child who has had relational trauma in their lifetime, and they have difficulty with so you start to talk to them about what they're feeling, and they can't identify what they're feeling. So your work begins with helping them learn what they're feeling in a safe environment. And from there, the work begins. Okay. They have an impaired sense of agency. What does that mean? It means that they don't have a sense of I, that they can take the initiative, that they can be assertive, that I can do this. It's mainly a subjective sense that things are going to be done to me in the world. Disruptions in the sense of continuity. Their sense of time can be disrupted both literally and figuratively. Big blocks of time, big chunks of their life just gone, absent. They can't remember things. I just met with a young woman the other day for an assessment. She's 26, and I began to talk to her about her childhood, and I said, well, tell me about when you were growing up, and she said, I have no memory under the age of 12. Not one single thing. She can't remember school. She can't remember her neighborhood. She can't remember her home. She can't remember what happened in her family. So immediately I'm thinking, that's a huge chunk of time in her life to literally not be able to remember. Something traumatic probably happened. Then there's the sense of discontinuity in terms of, when you're having a hard time, you can say to yourself, well, I felt something like this before in my life, and somehow I got through. I remember when such and such happened, and it felt bad, but I was able to get up and get going. When there's that discontinuity, you don't have that sense of history that tells you you'll live through this, you'll get by, it'll be okay. Then there's a lack of self-coherence. So you've got feelings and thoughts separated as much as possible, and you've got your memory closed off so that you feel kind of fragmented. And that's what they mean by a lack of a sense of self-coherence. To put the feelings and the thoughts together is to remember, and to remember can be so overwhelmingly painful for many adolescents who've been traumatized. So they walk around with a feeling of less self-coherence. Severe shame and guilt. Often those who've been traumatized take full responsibility for whatever happened to them. In this movie, if you watch it, this is an adolescent boy who was out sailing with his brother, and a storm comes up, and his brother drowns and he doesn't. So he takes full responsibility for his brother's death, and the survivor's guilt was insurmountable. What tipped the balance for him in the movie, as you'll see, is that his mother blamed him too. She never said it, but it was unspoken. So the other thing you find is intropunitive and self-destructive behavior, and this again is associated with suicidal ideation. Disavowal and repression or dissociation of the experience. You heard him talk in a way that sounded pretty dissociated, right? I mean, he's saying, I was falling through a hole and pretty soon the hole was me, and it didn't hurt. I didn't, Later, reflecting back, it's scary and frightening for him, but at the time, he has no feelings, and that's a dissociated state. And there's a profound sense of inner badness. Often what's happened is, I talked earlier about secure relationships develop because a child internalizes the love and the soothing and the care given by the primary caretaker and takes that in. Well, if you've had a primary caretaker who's been hurtful, you may take that in and internalize that sense of badness. Sometimes when you talk with younger children, they have a logic that follows like this. Something bad is happening. I must have done something bad. I am bad. And if that crystallizes, then they walk around feeling like they're a very bad person, like they're a monster. And I'm going to show another clip in a little while of an adolescent who called herself a monster because she internalized the bad experiences and thought that they could only happen because she made them happen. Again, some magical thinking going on there as a way of trying to deal with the betrayal of having been mistreated by a number of significant adults in her life. Shame and rage, twin offspring of cruelty. Children and adolescents, think how hard it is for us to tolerate feeling enraged. It is a terribly uncomfortable feeling. When you're a child with young defense mechanisms, with not fully developed cognitive resources, to feel rage is absolutely overwhelming, and then you feel very, very bad about it, and shame follows. Shame becomes the hidden secret. Shingold, who is a therapist who started talking about the effects of abuse decades and decades ago, said, "The essence of the therapeutic work is to diminish the power of the internalized destructive abuser by enabling the relationship with others that is meaningful and trustworthy." That somehow in a meaningful, consistent, reliable, not perfect relationship, a child begins to believe that they're not all bad, and they begin to internalize the way they're being treated by someone other than the earlier abuser. And they can gradually speak in a more positive way to themselves and give up that negative voice. Doesn't always go away, but they can begin to know what it is and know what it's about and not be punitive with themselves. And you'll know that things are going well if you've worked with an adolescent who feels horrible about themselves and is very self-punitive and very self-destructive, and you've been working with them and wondering, or her, and wondering, has anything worked? Have they been able to hold on to anything that goes on when they're with you? And then one day you'll hear, well, I was feeling really rotten about something, and I thought, I heard what you said about such and such. I remembered when you said to me such and such. And then you'll know that the treatment is starting to work because they're starting to hear your voice. It hasn't become their positive voice, but they've started to hear your voice. Hopelessness. Hopelessness is a huge risk, huge risk. Let's see. When I get you. It was identified as an independent risk factor for completed suicide and for suicide attempts and suicidal ideation in a 2004 research project at Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. And it was based on a 13-year community-based study. And they found that the association between suicidality and hopelessness was stronger and more stable than the association of suicidality and the presence of depression or of substance abuse. So that is even a greater independent risk factor than depression, hopelessness is. And the University of Colorado found that hopelessness was one of the 4 psychosocial factors to be the most important overall social suicide risk. The others included hostility, negative self-concept, and isolation. Recent change in therapy. This is a huge risk for adolescents. There's the rate of suicide attempt following transition from one type of therapy or from one therapist to another was significant. So if a child is being hospitalized or primarily being discharged from the hospital back out into the community, that transitional period, the adolescent, no matter how successful the inpatient stay was for stabilizing the adolescent, if there was an immediate follow-up, that transitional period was high risk. So if you're working with an adolescent and they've been hospitalized, you want to see them that afternoon, that next morning, and follow them very, very closely. That's a high risk period. Also for an adolescent who's had loss and who has become suicidal following loss, early childhood loss or recent loss, breakup with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or something, if you change therapists, that's another high-risk transition. So you want to, if you can, I know I'm giving you the ideal here, meet together, the 2 therapists, arrange transitions, let the new therapist let the adolescent know that they've been in touch with the old therapist, spend time talking about the old therapist, allow them to grieve the loss, to feel that you're not who they really want, give them plenty of support, opportunity to do that kind of grief work, because a recent change in therapist is a high risk for another suicide attempt. Richmond's risk characteristics: exhaustion of personal resources, exhaustion of familial resources, a state of intolerable stress and distress, and then finally the perception of suicide as a viable solution. Cognitive constriction. So what you have that's come together to make a horrifically perfect storm, you have intolerable affect. The pain is so bad and the stress is so severe, coupled with the cognition, the thought that there is no other solution. So you bring those together and that creates great risk for suicide attempts and suicide completion. And here you want to be aware of the calmness that comes with finally making a decision, and the relief of having finally decided that you're going to do away with this pain, you're going to do away with all the negative experiences in your life. So don't let, if you're working with an adolescent and they've been agitated, if they've been inconsolable, and then they become